The generator hums somewhere behind the wall, a low mechanical throat clearing that never quite stops. It is just past 6 in the morning on August 6, 1890, in the death house at Auburn Prison, New York, and the leather straps on the chair have already been tightened once, then loosened, then tightened again. Because the guard's hands are not steady, William Kemmler sits down without being told to. He asks quietly whether it will hurt. Nobody answers him directly. The electrician standing near the wall switch, a man named Edwin Davis, keeps his eyes on the dial in front of him, not on the prisoner, because he has never done this before. Either, nobody in the history of the world has done this before. What none of the men in that small brick room fully understand yet, though some of them will find out within the next 8 minutes, is that the object beneath Kemmler is not really new at all. It is very old. It has simply never been asked to do this particular job before. For nearly 4,000 years, the chair had been used to decide something else entirely. Not who dies, but who rules. So how did an object built to hold up kings end up wired to a New York State generator, deciding the last seconds of a convicted man's life? To answer that, we have to go back a long way before this Tuesday morning in Auburn. Not 3 days, but closer to 4,000 years, to a tomb sealed in the hills above the Nile. In November 1922, the British archaeologist Howard Carter cut through a plaster doorway in the Valley of the Kings and lowered a candle into the dark. And among the objects that had waited there since roughly 2023 BCE was a wooden throne covered in gold leaf and inlaid glass, its arms shaped like protective cobras, its back panel showing the young pharaoh Tutankhamun seated while his wife anoints him with oil. Note the detail carefully. He is seated, she is standing. In the world that built this throne, sitting was not comfort. It was a declaration. Ordinary Egyptians of the period did not use chairs at all. They crouched. They knelt on woven reed mats. They sat on the packed earth floor of a one-room mud brick house, while the smell of bread baking on a clay disk mixed with river silt drifting in from an open doorway. A chair, in that world, was a throne by definition, because only a god-king's body was permitted the honor of being lifted off the ground. That idea did not stay buried with Tutankhamun. It traveled west, and centuries later it resurfaced in the Roman Republic in a different, almost bureaucratic form. The Curule, a folding stool with curved ivory legs, no back, no cushion, carried by an attendant and set down wherever a magistrate needed to conduct public business. Roman law was specific about who could use it. Only officials holding imperium, consuls, praetors, curule aediles, were entitled to the curule chair, and it traveled with them the way a modern head of state's motorcade travels with a flag on the hood. Everyone else in the forum that day stood on the paving stones, sandals scraping the worn marble, while the magistrate's ivory legs clicked shut and were folded away like a piece of stagecraft once the business of the day was done. Standing was default. Sitting was authority made visible, portable, and enforceable by law. By the time we reach medieval England, the pattern has hardened into something you can still hear in an office building today without realizing it. Picture the great hall of a 14th century manor on a winter evening. Smoke curling along the blackened roof beams because the hearth has no chimney yet. Tallow candles guttering in iron sconces. The long trestle tables crowded with retainers sitting shoulder to shoulder on backless benches, elbows knocking, the smell of roasted mutton and spilled ale thick in the air. At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform called the Dais, sits the lord of the manor, and he alone sits in an actual chair with arms and a back, often the only one in the entire building. His wife might be granted a smaller version. Everyone else, his knights, his steward, his priest, makes do with stools and benches. This is not a small detail. It is where an entire vocabulary comes from. The person who occupies the chair chairs the meeting. A university department still gives its senior scholar a chair. A company still calls its presiding officer the chairman of the board. We use these words every day without remembering that they describe an actual piece of furniture that only one body in the room was legally and socially permitted to sit in. Cross the channel now, and skip forward 3 centuries, to the court of Louis XIV at Versailles in the late 1600s, where the furniture etiquette became so exact it bordered on the absurd. And yet the surviving court records and courtier memoirs, including those of the Duke of Saint-Simon, describe it in careful, almost obsessive detail, because at Versailles, getting it wrong could end a career. There were 3 tiers of seating permitted in the presence of the king and queen: an armchair, called a fauteuil, reserved for royalty itself, a chair with a back but no arms, for certain high nobility, and a simple stool without a back, called a tabouret, granted as a rare and jealously guarded privilege to a small number of duchesses. Historians still argue over exactly how many women held this privilege at any one time, and how rigidly it was enforced in practice, but the concept itself, known at court as the droit du tabouret, the right of the stool, is documented well enough that we know women petitioned for years, married strategically, and called in old family debts, all for the right to perch on a backless stool in a cold hallway smelling of beeswax and candle smoke, simply because everyone else in that hallway had to remain standing. Silk rustled against marble. Nobody complained out loud. The chair, again, was not comfort. It was rank, made visible in wood and fabric. Here's where the story quietly turns, and where the meaning of everything we've just described gets flipped on its head. Because while European courts were still arguing over who deserved the right to sit down, an entirely different force was working to put a chair, an ordinary, unglamorous, mass-produced chair, under almost everybody. In 1859, a German-Austrian carpenter named Michael Sonnet, working out of a Vienna workshop, perfected a technique for steaming solid beechwood and bending it into curved forms without cutting or splicing the wood, and from that technique came chair number 14, 6 pieces of bent beech, 10 screws, held together without glue, designed to be shipped disassembled in flat crates, so that dozens of chairs could travel in the space that had once held only a handful. By 1930, company and design history records suggest tens of millions of units of that single chair design. A figure often cited as around 50 million had been sold across Europe and beyond. For the first time in the object's long history, sitting in a proper chair, arms optional, back included, was not a mark of nobility. It was something a cafe waiter, a schoolteacher, a factory clerk could simply buy. You would think that once the chair became common, its old meaning, power, rank, the right to be raised off the ground while others stood, would fade quietly into folklore, and for most people, it did. But at almost the exact same moment that Thonet's bentwood chairs were filling the cafes of Vienna and Paris on the other side of the Atlantic, the chair's oldest meaning was about to be twisted into something almost nobody in that Auburn death house fully understood at the time. And this is the detail that changes how everything before it should be read. The electric chair was never simply a humane replacement for hanging, dreamed up by reformers alone. Its invention was tangled up in a bitter commercial war between 2 rival electrical systems, and the chair itself became, quite deliberately, a weapon in that fight. In the mid-1880s, Thomas Edison's direct current, or DC, electrical business was losing ground to George Westinghouse's alternating current, or AC system, which was cheaper to distribute over long distances, but which Edison's camp argued was more dangerous. A self-styled electrical engineer named Harold P. Brown, who had close informal ties to Edison's company and even used Edison's own laboratory in Orange, New Jersey, set out in 1888 to prove that AC current was, in his words, an executioner's current. Brown staged public demonstrations in which dogs, calves, and eventually a horse were electrocuted using Westinghouse's alternating current, in front of reporters and members of the New York State Legislature, and the newspapers of the day began using a grim new verb for it, to be Westinghoused. Historians still debate exactly how directly Edison himself was involved, versus how much was driven by Brown's own initiative. But the paper trail, laboratory access, letters, testimony before the state's death commission, shows Edison's company was far from a neutral bystander. The goal was not humane execution. The goal was to permanently attach Westinghouse's name and his current to death in the public imagination. And to do that, the state of New York needed an execution device. It needed, specifically, a chair. The New York State Legislature adopted electrocution as the new method of capital punishment in 1888, and the machine built for it, wired to run on alternating current, became known simply as the chair. William Kendler, convicted of murdering his common-law wife with a hatchet, became the test case almost by unlucky coincidence of timing, and his lawyers. Quietly funded, it later emerged by Westinghouse himself, who wanted to prove the new device was cruel and unusual punishment, fought the sentence all the way to the United States Supreme Court and lost. Which brings us back to that small brick room at Auburn, 6 a.m, the strap tightening around Kemmler's chest, the hum behind the wall growing louder. The first jolt lasted 17 seconds. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe smoke rising faintly from beneath the straps, and the attending physicians, believing the procedure complete, stepped forward to pronounce death, only to see Kemmler's chest still moving. A second, much longer charge had to be applied. Reporters present, including correspondents for the New York Times, described the scene in language so graphic that several newspapers that had campaigned for electrocution as more humane than hanging began, within days, to question whether it was humane at all. George Westinghouse, when told what had happened, was widely quoted at the time as saying they could have done better with an axe. Though, as with much from that chaotic morning, historians note the exact wording and even the full authorship of that remark remain disputed. What is not disputed is the outcome. The execution took roughly 8 minutes from first switch to declared death, and the room reportedly smelled, according to witnesses, of burning that nobody present ever fully described in writing, because some details were considered too disturbing to print in a family newspaper of 1890. Though the chair that had once decided who was permitted to rule a hall, a court, a kingdom, had been rewired, quite literally, to decide who was permitted to live, and the reason it happened in Auburn on that particular morning had less to do with justice than with a corporate rivalry over which kind of electric current would light American cities. That is the turn worth sitting with for a moment. An object born to elevate emperors ended the 19th century wired into a fight between two businessmen who were not really thinking about Kemmler at all. The consequences of that morning did not stay contained to Auburn prison. Electrocution spread to other states through the early 20th century, and the electric chair remained a method of execution in parts of the United States for well over 100 years after Kemmler, used less and less often as lethal injection became the default, but never fully retired. As recently as January 16, 2013, a Virginia man named Robert Gleason chose the electric chair over lethal injection for his own execution, a reminder that the object built in a hurry to win a 19th century business war was still, in living memory, doing exactly the job it had been rewired to do. Meanwhile, the far more common story of the chair kept unfolding in a completely different direction, and this is worth pausing on, because it is the version of the object almost all of us actually live with. Dais. In the Chiltern Hills of England, through the 18th and 19th centuries, itinerant craftsmen known locally as bodgers set up temporary camps in beech woodland, turning chair legs on foot-powered pole lathes from green, unseasoned wood, supplying the workshops of High Wycombe that assembled what we now call the Windsor chair, a design so unpretentious it became the default seating of taverns, farmhouses, and eventually American colonial homes, carried across the Atlantic until it sat in the rooms where the Declaration of Independence was drafted. And in 1994, the design firm Herman Miller released the Aeron chair, engineered by Bill Stumpf and Don Chadwick using a breathable mesh material originally developed for hospital beds, a chair built not for kings or condemned men, but for the very specific modern problem of a body sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day, a design considered significant enough that the Museum of Modern Art in New York added it to its permanent collection. This is worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further because it touches something quietly personal. There is a decent chance you are sitting in a chair right now, listening to this, Your body is doing something that for most of human history was not a neutral everyday act at all. It was a privilege that people negotiated, married for, and occasionally died defending, whether it was a duchess petitioning for a tabouret at Versailles or a magistrate's slave setting down an ivory curule stool in the Roman Forum. The fact that an ordinary chair now sits in nearly every room of an ordinary home is not a small footnote in furniture history. It is the end result of Michael Thonet's steamed beechwood, a factory production lines of centuries of the chair's meaning slowly, unevenly, trickling downward from the one body allowed to sit to every body in the room. And yet, the darker half of the chair's story has never entirely gone away either. It sits. The word feels almost too fitting. Inside the language we still use without noticing it, the hot seat, a phrase that originally referred, quite literally, to the electric chair, before it drifted into boardrooms and job interviews as a metaphor for pressure. Every time someone jokes about being called into the boss's office to sit in a hot seat, they are borrowing, without knowing it, from a brick room in Auburn, New York, in 1890. If there is a shape to all of this worth carrying away, it might be these three things. First, that for most of human history, the simple act of sitting in a proper chair was not comfort, but rank, a right claimed by pharaohs, Roman magistrates, and Versailles duchesses fighting over a backless stool. Second, that the humble, mass-produced chair we now take for granted, the one bent from steamed beechwood in a Vienna workshop in 1859, quietly did more to erase that ancient hierarchy than any revolution or law ever managed. And third, that the same object, at the very moment it was becoming common furniture for ordinary people, was also being rewired in a New York prison to end a life, not primarily out of justice, but out of a business rivalry over electric current, a fact that still sits, largely unspoken, underneath the very word we use for a position of authority. Back in that brick room at Auburn, once the doctors had confirmed what needed confirming, the straps were unbuckled, the leather already darkening at the edges, and the chair itself, the actual wooden and metal object, not a symbol, not a metaphor, an object with weight and grain and cooling copper fittings, was left standing there in the gray morning light while the men who had used it filed out without much conversation. It would be used again. According to some accounts, it may still exist in storage somewhere in New York State, though its exact fate after retirement is not well documented. So the next time you pull a chair out from under a table, or watch a boardroom scene in a film where someone is finally allowed to sit at the head of the table, it might be worth asking yourself what exactly you are being given permission to do, and whether some small trace of that old strange logic, the logic of the throne, the curl stool, and the tabouret, is still quietly built into the object under you. Main sources for this story include Mark Essig's book Edison and the Electric Chair, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's published records on Tutankhamun's throne, and the Thonet Company's own historical archive on chair number 14. The full list is in the description.